You were never meant to hear this. Not the names, not the testimonies, not the facts buried under a century of government silence and half-burned medical records. But tonight, we dig. There's a name hidden in the darker margins of America's religious frontier. Ashford. Not a family, not in the traditional sense. More like a design, a lineage of minds too dangerous to leave in Europe, too valuable to destroy, and too corrupted to ever set free. You've heard of cults, you've heard of convents, but you've never heard of a compound built from stone so thick no scream could escape, because that scream wasn't meant to be silenced, it was meant to be studied. For over 3 decades in the cold, forgotten woods of Maine, women entered what they were told was a place of prayer. What they found was not salvation. It was a laboratory. 3 sisters, Ashford by name, not by blood, bound not by God but by purpose. They arrived under the guise of religion, but what they practiced was something far older than scripture and far colder than science. They were surgeons of the soul, philosophers of pain, theologians of obedience, and what they believed, what they did, makes every story you've ever heard about mind control sound like child's play. Tonight, I'll take you step by step into the real history, the scrubbed one, the kind not taught in textbooks, because if it were, you'd never sleep again. 33 revelations, each one worse than the last, each one peeling back the skin of what you thought history was. And by the end, if you're still here, still listening, you'll never look at a place of healing the same way again. This isn't just a tale about lost women. It's about a system, a design, a blueprint for control hidden in the guise of morality. And if you think it ended in 1830, you're already part of it. You've heard the phrase, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. But this isn't history. It's the instruction manual that was never supposed to be found. Let's begin. They called her Mother Agatha, but she had no children, only subjects. Her presence was not maternal. It was imperial. When she entered a room, even men who'd held rifles in war found themselves standing straighter, quieter, unsure why. It wasn't her voice, though it carried a cold authority. It wasn't her eyes, though they saw through lies like panes of ice. It was her belief, unshakable, ruthless, absolute. She believed that suffering was necessary, not as punishment but as process. To break a person, you didn't need violence, just silence, isolation, controlled deprivation of warmth, light, and self. She didn't build a convent, she engineered a psychological crucible. Every stone was chosen not just for weight, but for acoustics. Every window placed not for beauty, but surveillance. Agatha understood the human mind as few have ever dared. She once wrote, in a letter never meant for eyes outside the order, "The soul clings to pain like a child to its mother. Strip away distraction, and it reveals its true shape." That letter was found sealed inside a lead tube buried beneath the foundation of the chapel, unearthed in 1941 during a state excavation. The lead was etched with Latin, Sanctum Doloris, the sanctuary of pain. What did Agatha know, more than she should have? Rumors from England spoke of her time in Edinburgh, where she studied under a now erased physician specializing in neurotheology, a forbidden hybrid of spiritual manipulation and neurological experimentation. The Ashford name appeared in no birth records, no baptismal logs. She did not come from nobility. She came from somewhere darker, a lineage of displaced intellectuals exiled from the Anglican Church for ideas too dangerous to entertain and too precise to disprove. When she arrived in America, Agatha did not kneel. She built an altar to control, and then she began recruiting. First her sisters, then her patients. But calling them patients was the final insult, because what Agatha performed beneath those stone walls wasn't therapy, it was modification. You see, Agatha didn't believe in healing. She believed in erasure, the erasure of identity, rebellion, memory. She called it sanctification. But if you strip a woman's mind, what is left? Only what you install, only what you design. And that, my friend, is the beginning of systems that still operate today, behind new names, new symbols, but always the same silence. Prudence Ashford never spoke more than necessary. Not out of shyness, but calculation. She didn't waste words because she didn't waste anything. Not time, not movement, not thought. Every step she took was deliberate, every gesture rehearsed. Watching her was like watching a machine that had learned how to mimic grace. But make no mistake, she was not beautiful like her younger counterpart. There was nothing warm in her presence. She was sterile, bone-pale, her skin untouched by sun, her lips thin and bloodless. But her hands were revered, not by the public, but by those who paid for results. Hands steady as death, hands that could open a skull without trembling, hands that had never held a child but had touched the inner workings of the human brain more than most surgeons of her time, or ours. She was the architect of what happened below the convent, the mind chamber, the sanctum. And she didn't build it out of cruelty, she built it out of hunger. Prudence believed the human mind was a series of locked doors, and she was the master key. She designed procedures that were never recorded in medical journals, things that bypassed the limits of 18th century understanding. She'd seen too much, read too deeply, learned from too many silenced men in too many forbidden halls of European academia. She once whispered to a patient, whose diary was later smuggled out, "You think your thoughts are yours, but thought is just electricity waiting to be rerouted." It wasn't madness, it was ambition. She believed obedience wasn't just behavioral, it was chemical, anatomical. If you stimulate one part of the brain, fear; another, euphoria; another, silence. She mapped these territories like a cartographer of consciousness, carving not rivers and mountains but screams and sighs. What's more terrifying? She was right. Multiple survivors, des apart, described the same sensations the moment they stopped resisting and wanted to obey, not because they were broken, but because they had been rewired. Prudence didn't believe in punishment. She believed in calibration, and her tools, not just scalpels and syringes, but suggestion, sensory deprivation, smells, sounds, light. She used the environment like a scalpel, slicing into the spirit. And her legacy? You see it today in places you don't question, in institutions that still call themselves corrective. She showed the world you don't need cages to trap a mind. You just need the right trigger. Temperance Ashford was the invitation. The face on the pamphlet, the soft voice at the threshold, the thing you saw before you stepped inside and never came back. She was young, but not innocent. Beautiful, but not inviting. Her beauty didn't comfort, it disarmed. Imagine a porcelain doll with eyes too dark to reflect light. Imagine that doll watching you, not blinking, not smiling, just memorizing. That was Temperance. She was the one families remembered. The one who welcomed daughters into the convent with a gentle hand and a voice like warm honey. But behind her stillness, there was calculation. Cold, predatory, precise. Her role, acquisition. She identified which women could be reformed, and which would not return. Temperance handled the intake process. She performed the interviews. She asked the questions that sounded spiritual but were psychological traps. She noted tone, posture, hesitation. She wasn't looking for sin. She was measuring malleability. And when the wrong kind of girl arrived, the kind with sharp thoughts, unshakable memory, or worse, hope, Temperance would smile and personally escort her to solitude. Some girls were never seen again. Others returned altered. Not broken, just vacant, like a light had been switched off behind their eyes. One survivor, decades later, described Temperance's voice as the last human sound I heard before the descent. But her power wasn't in what she did. It was what she symbolized. To the women who entered the convent, Temperance seemed like proof that transformation was possible. She had that clean, saintly glow, untouched by dirt, by violence, by doubt. But that was the illusion. She was the final product, the model, the success story they dangled in front of the broken. But underneath her poise was something ancient. There were whispers, barely believed, never proven, that she wasn't born Temperance, that she was adopted into the fold after surviving another experiment in Europe, that her brain was altered before she ever came to America, that she was the prototype. Whether that's true or not, one thing is certain: every woman who met her described the same feeling, like standing on the edge of a cliff and wanting to fall. Because that's the trick of real control. It doesn't shove you, it invites you, and the face that invites you always looks like salvation, until it's too late to turn back. There were floors on the blueprints, 3 stories, a chapel, dormitories, infirmary, kitchens, all standard for a religious sanctuary. But the basement, the real basement, was never drawn. Not publicly, because the Ashford Sisters didn't trust paper. They trusted stone. A laborer named Eli Benson, long dead now, wrote a letter to his brother in 1801. That letter remained sealed until it was unearthed in a family Bible in 1977. It said this: "We've been laying brick in circles, not walls, rings. There's a center chamber, no windows, only one door made of iron. Every corridor leads back to it like a spoke." I asked the tall one, the one with the chalk-white hands, what it was for. She said, "Containment." I said, "Of what?" And she smiled like I'd told a joke. These weren't prayer rooms. They were containment units. And every one of them had locks, not just outside, but inside. Ventilation shafts that filtered sound but not air, drainage trenches deep enough to carry gallons of fluid, and grooves in the floor, not decorative, functional, like channels. Why build such rooms? Why hide them? And why, when local masons asked what they were constructing, were they told simply, "The sisters prefer privacy for their most sacred rituals"? Witness accounts describe walls lined with dark wooden cabinets, not for storage, for observation, small peepholes, sliding panels, devices attached to the walls, some described as lenses, others as mirrors. But here's the detail that matters most. Every room had a mirror facing the center. Every room was wired for listening, not with electricity, but with brass tubes and cone-shaped instruments designed to transmit sound through floors and walls. Primitive surveillance, designed not for protection, but for study. They weren't just observing patients, they were recording reactions to stress, to isolation, to silence, to suggestion. And those rings of rooms, they were experiments in social erasure. One former caretaker, who fled in 1811 and disappeared, allegedly told a tavern owner before vanishing, "They're mapping the descent. They want to know how long it takes a woman to stop speaking, how many days before she forgets her name." It was never about healing. It was about timing. How quickly can you reduce a human mind to raw material? How long before someone becomes a shadow? They weren't running a convent. They were running simulations, and what they learned didn't stay in Maine. It spread, like rot under polished floorboards. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a name you'll never find in medical textbooks, but whose fingerprints are all over the institutional systems we still use today. He wasn't just the Ashfords' partner. He was their bridge, the man who translated horror into data, a physician with a reputation for modern thought, which in 1802 meant exactly one thing: he was willing to cut where others prayed. He saw the Ashford compound not as a threat, but as an opportunity, a living laboratory with dozens of subjects, total isolation, and no oversight. And what they offered him was access, full medical records, surgical diagrams, psychological notes that would make even modern psychiatrists nauseous. He became their supplier. In exchange for funding and private observations, he funneled them medicine, instruments, and most disturbingly, people. Women he deemed unfit for traditional asylums, girls labeled hysterical, melancholic, insubordinate. He referred them to the Ashfords with one word scribbled on each intake form: sanctificandum, Latin. It means to be made holy. But in the records that survived, every woman stamped with that word was never seen again. Dr. Hartwell didn't just sell bodies, he sold silence. He manipulated the town's perception, masking the sisters' operations with language the people respected. He told elders the sisters were developing advanced methods for mental realignment. He told grieving fathers their daughters were purifying their thoughts. He built a wall of words around a fortress of pain. And worse, he documented it. Hartwell kept meticulous notes, not for morality, for profit. Observations of physical reactions, behavioral changes, emotional shutdown points. In one entry he wrote, Subject 27 ceased independent speech on day 16 of containment. Eye movement slowed by 40%. Requests for food replaced with passive compliance. It was clear that sensory limitation followed by structured ritual produces docility within 2 weeks. He wasn't healing anyone, he was refining the method, and what he refined was exported. By 1815 his notes had made their way to Harvard. By 1822 echoes of his language appeared in new asylum models, behavioral sanctums, reflective therapy cells, cathartic dormancy wings. He created a vocabulary for quiet control, the kind that doesn't bruise, the kind that leaves no visible mark, but leaves the soul empty, hollow, eager to obey, because true obedience isn't taught, it's extracted. And Hartwell, he wasn't a doctor, he was the Ashford's mouthpiece, the man who made horror sound like healing. There are still men in Millbridge, very old now, who remember the story their grandfathers told. The winter of 1803, a night so silent you could hear the sap freeze in the trees, a sky clear enough to see the stars shiver, and then, just past midnight, a scream. Not human, not animal. Something between. It echoed through the pines, across snow-covered fields, through walls, into dreams. They say the birds didn't fly for days after. They say the wolves disappeared for a week. But what caused it? One name, Thomas Brewster. He was just a trapper, 20 years old, tough from the woods, quiet, practical, the kind of man who didn't scare easy. But what he saw that night, through a frost-covered basement window, broke something in him that never healed. He didn't see a convent. He saw a theater, a surgical theater, lamplight glowing off stone walls slick with moisture. A woman strapped to a table, screaming as metal pierced her skull. Her face twisted in agony, eyes wide with something worse than fear, awareness. She knew what they were doing, and she knew they were enjoying it. He saw Prudence, serene, focused, guiding a rod into the woman's exposed brain. Agatha nearby, recording notes with calm detachment. Temperance handing tools with the elegance of a dancer. It wasn't chaos. It was ritual. And when the woman finally stopped screaming, not from mercy but from unconsciousness, the sisters continued, talking in hushed tones, measuring responses, as if her brain were a puzzle to be solved. Thomas ran, through snow, through darkness, through disbelief. When he reached town, he burst into his father's blacksmith shop, raving, shaking, desperate to unsee what he had seen. But here's where the real horror begins. No one believed him. Not fully. Not enough. His father blamed exhaustion. Deacon Morrison called it hysteria from prolonged exposure. And in the most polite words possible, they told him to forget. Because if what he said was true, that meant everything they trusted, the Ashfords, the sanctuary, the healing, was a lie. And no one wants to believe they handed their daughters over to monsters. So the town did what towns do best. They buried the truth beneath politeness. They paved over the scream. But Thomas never forgot. Because that scream, it wasn't the woman's. It was the moment a mind shattered, and something else looked out. After that night, something changed. Not in the convent. No, that place ran like clockwork, cold and precise as ever. What changed was the noise, or rather, the lack of it. The woods around the compound, once filled with birdsong, the rustle of deer, the howls of distant wolves, became deathly still. Even the river, which ran just a mile east, seemed to hush itself when it neared those walls. Locals noticed. They whispered. The Ashfords must have improved insulation, or perhaps the snow simply muffled sound better that year. Easy lies told over mugs of steaming cider. But the truth was simpler and darker. The screams had stopped because the Ashfords had adapted. They had learned from Thomas Brewster's discovery. The next subjects were sedated earlier. Soundproofing was enhanced. Basement windows were bricked over, vents sealed, access tunnels rerouted underground, and those who delivered new patients, doctors, priests, husbands, were given a new phrase to comfort their doubts. Some healing must happen in silence. That line would echo for decades in church confessionals and hospital hallways. But for the Ashfords, it was more than a metaphor. It was policy. They perfected a kind of treatment that didn't just erase identity. It replaced it, with routine, with obedience, with something worse than emptiness. Compliance. Patients didn't scream anymore. They whispered prayers in unison. They moved in synchronized steps. They smiled at walls and wept in their sleep. One visiting nun, who stayed only 3 days before fleeing to Portland, described it like this in her journal. They do not look at you. They look through you, like they've been taught that seeing is dangerous. And when they do speak, it's like they're reciting words that don't belong to them, like someone else is pulling the strings. She never returned. Nor did her journal. T vanished from diocesan records a month after it was filed. Because the Ashfords weren't just silencing women, they were perfecting a blueprint, and blueprints can be copied. In hospitals, in schools, in churches. Anywhere obedience is sold as virtue, and silence is rewarded with safety. Ask yourself, when was the last time you questioned the silence? Because real horror doesn't scream. It nods, smiles, obeys, and it waits, patiently, for the next visitor to walk through the door and not notice what's missing. In 1847, a farmhouse fire unearthed something it shouldn't have. A charred metal box, locked with rusted iron clasps, hidden beneath floorboards soaked in soot and age. Inside, pages. Burned at the edges, blackened in places, but still legible. A diary, written in a spidery, precise hand. Signed, C.M. No full name, no date of entry, just the initials of someone who had lived, and almost certainly died, behind the walls of the convent of eternal tears. The diary began like prayer. They told me my voice was sinful, that my laughter drew devils, that thoughts, my thoughts, were weeds choking the garden of purity. And so they began, the pruning. She writes of days spent in solitude, no windows, no clocks, no calendar, only rituals. Waking, kneeling, bathing, kneeling again. Writing lines like punishment. I must be emptied. I must not question. Pain is not punishment. Pain is the door. Then the procedures began. Cold hands, needles, devices that hummed like bees behind the walls. She was strapped to a chair, shown flickering images, flashing lights, made to listen to a voice, always the same voice, reciting her name over and over, until it didn't sound like hers anymore. They took it from me, my name, my anger, my memory, but not my awareness. And that's where the tone shifts. Because CM, whoever she was, began to remember things she wasn't meant to. Conversations behind closed doors. Notes slipped between trays of food. Other girls, dozens, each reduced to a number. And then, the escape plan. She mentions a woman named Helena, a former nurse. One of them. Helena had grown disillusioned, said she saw something, a trial gone wrong. Something that broke a girl so completely, her body kept breathing. But her eyes never blinked again. Helena wanted out. She planned to burn the files, unlock the door, disappear into the pines. The diary ends mid-sentence. Tonight we light the fire, If I do not return, if this box is found, let it be known. Let it be known. 3 words. And then ash. The house that burned, it belonged to a woman named Helena Stroud. Cause of death, accidental stove explosion. But the locals still talk about the firelight that night. They say it didn't glow orange. They say it burned blue. Like something sacred was trying to scream one last time. The Ashford Sisters did not invent their methods. They inherited them, refined them, codified them, and buried them behind scripture. Hidden among the convent's internal records, those not meant for outside eyes, was a leather-bound volume referred to simply as The Doctrine, a handwritten manual. No title on the cover, no author. Just a series of numbered tenets outlining the philosophical core of the Ashford system. Tenets that had nothing to do with God, and everything to do with control. Here are just a few. Tenet way. The self is a lie, maintained through comfort. Strip comfort, and the lie collapses. Tenet the 3. Pain is not a punishment. It is a cleansing. The mind resists only when it believes it has the right to exist as it is. Tenet 7. Memory is an anchor. Cut the rope. Each section focused on a different method of extraction. That's the word they used. Extraction. Not healing. Not conversion. Extraction. As if the soul were a tumor, and obedience the scalpel. The doctrine details the use of rhythm, chants, steps, even breath, synchronization as a weapon. It describes the deliberate confusion of language, changing the meanings of familiar words until subjects no longer trust their own thoughts. A smile becomes sin, a question becomes defiance, sleep becomes privilege, and obedience becomes freedom. It also mentions chemical methods, mixtures of herbs and tinctures imported from overseas, nightshade, wormwood, ergot, not to kill, to weaken the threshold between thought and suggestion, to dissolve boundaries between self and other, to make a person pliable. The doctrine references older texts, ones lost to time, medieval treatises on ecstatic compliance, ancient monastic writings about sacred forgetting. But what chills the spine is this. Final tenet, text 8. When the subject no longer names herself, when she turns toward the voice and says yes before it speaks, then the work is done. Then we have created not a servant, but a vessel. Think about that. Not a servant, a vessel, empty, useful, contained. And the sisters didn't stop at women. Rumors swirl of younger boys, test subjects, early trials, sacrifice to learn how far the mind could bend before it broke. The doctrine was no religious guide. It was a manual of modification. And it still exists. Parts of it have resurfaced in classified military training documents, others in obscure therapy practices, and some are still being tested, behind newer walls, with softer lighting, and bigger budgets. His name was Elias Row. He wasn't a scholar, not a priest, not a politician, just a gravedigger, the kind of man no one notices unless he doesn't show up for work. But Elias had something the Ashfords couldn't predict. He had guilt. He'd helped build the foundation of the convent, hauled stone, mixed mortar, dug trenches, and he remembered things, details that haunted him decades later. Like how the basement walls were triple thick in only one room, how one door was lined with lead, how they used lime to seal the drains, not to prevent leaks, but to neutralize blood. Years passed. He aged. The whispers in town never stopped, but no one listened. And one night, after hearing about another girl who vanished on her way to seek spiritual counsel, Elias snapped. He returned to the convent with a bottle of whiskey and a cart full of pitch. He was going to burn it down, not for justice, but for revenge. He didn't make it past the main gate. The story goes, and this comes from the tavern keeper's son, who swore he saw it from the tree line, Elias lit the torch, approached the chapel, and froze, not from fear, from something else. His body locked. He dropped the torch. Then he walked, not ran, walked, into the woods. He was found 3 days later. Naked, covered in scratches, eyes swollen shut from crying. When they asked what happened, he said, "They knew I was coming, before I knew I was coming." They took him to the infirmary, tried to feed him, tried to calm him, but he just kept repeating the same phrase. The voice inside wasn't mine. He died 6 weeks later. No cause ever confirmed. Some say he was poisoned. Others believe his mind simply cracked. But here's the detail no one could explain. When they retrieved his body for burial, they found something sewn into the lining of his coat, a piece of parchment, stained, faded. One lied, written in a woman's hand. The eye is watching from within. No one knows who wrote it. No one knows how it got there. But it matched the ink found in the recovered Doctrine. Elias Row tried to burn the truth. But the truth had already burned into him. Because once you see the machine behind the curtain, it doesn't just haunt you. It follows. They called it the Chamber of Reflection. Not publicly, of course. The townsfolk knew it only as the chapel's inner sanctum, a place reserved for the deepest purification, a term Agatha used with the kind of reverence that masked the horror underneath. But those who entered it, they knew better. It wasn't a place for prayer. It was a place for disassembly. The room had no altar, no crucifix, no hymns, only mirrors. Every wall, every corner, every surface, even the ceiling was polished silver or smoked glass, some warped, some angled, none forgiving. Imagine standing naked in the center, no clothes, no light except a single flame suspended overhead, no sound but your own breath bouncing back at you from 100 different angles. And then the chant begins. Soft. Female voices, layered in thirds, whispering your name. Not angrily, not lovingly, just patiently, as if waiting for you to break. The Ashfords believed the mirror room could fracture identity, not metaphorically, neurologically. They placed women inside for hours, sometimes days, deprived of time, touch, food, surrounded only by their own reflection, until the brain no longer recognized it. One survivor, in her only interview before she was institutionalized, described it like this. At first I saw myself. Then I saw a stranger. Then I saw her move when I didn't. The Ashfords kept records of the symptoms. First came disassociation, then auditory shifts, voices that mimicked your thoughts but spoke in different intentions. Then, finally, surrender. The subject would begin answering questions not asked, confessing sins they'd never committed, smiling for no reason, crying without memory of why. In those moments, Temperance would enter. She would sit beside the subject, stroke their hand, call them by a new name, and if they answered to it just once, the procedure was declared a success. They had been rewritten. This ritual wasn't about punishment. It was about extraction of the I, the self, the belief that you are you and no one else. Once that's gone, anything can be inserted. Faith, fear, obedience, mission. And the worst part? We still use it today. Modern sensory therapy chambers, mirror meditation, isolation tanks. It's been sanitized, marketed. But the architecture remains, because when you stare into a mirror long enough, it doesn't reflect you back. It asks who you are. And if you hesitate, someone else answers. They never got tombstones. They never got eulogies. Just shallow graves in the pine woods behind the convent, marked with sticks. No carvings, no symbols. Sometimes not even that. They were the unfit. The girls who didn't respond to treatment, who resisted too long, who screamed when they were supposed to be silent, who remembered when they were supposed to forget, and for that, they vanished. Their names were scrubbed from ledgers. Letters to families stopped. Their stories became footnotes in church logs, often followed by the same cold phrase, "departed in spiritual unrest." But some names survived. Barely. Smuggled into the margins of hymnals, scratched into bed frames, whispers preserved in oral stories passed down by terrified caretakers who'd fled. Mary Ellen, June, Clara, Anika, Ruth, Sophia. 6 names, 6 resistors, 6 failures of the system. And yet, it's because of them that we know the truth. One nurse, only known as Elise, risked her life to steal notes. She saw what the sisters were doing and couldn't stay silent. She hid pages beneath floorboards, sewed names into hems, kept strands of hair as identifiers. And her final act? A map. Drawn in charcoal, wrapped in oilcloth, and buried beneath the base of the convent's south-facing statue. A Virgin Mary with no eyes. The map showed a cluster of trees behind the chapel, marked X 6 times. In 1994, a storm uprooted one of those trees. Beneath it, human remains, shallow, twisted, bones with evidence of binding, of surgical trauma, but no official investigation followed. Why? Because the land had changed hands. The convent had long since been sold, repurposed, converted into a private spiritual retreat owned by a silent trust, the kind that doesn't list board members, the kind that never responds to letters. They claimed ignorance. They claimed no knowledge of prior activity on the property. And then, the site was closed. Fenced, monitored. Today, hikers who venture near those woods report strange sensations. The feeling of being watched, of voices echoing without a source. And always, always, the same dream afterward. Girls, dressed in white, standing in a circle. Heads bowed, mouths open. But no sound, because they can't speak. Not anymore. But if you listen long enough, you don't hear their cries. You hear your own name, spoken from mouths that never belonged to them. You didn't hear about the Ashfords in newspapers. You heard about them in kitchens, in whispers, in the moments just after the lamp was blown out and someone said, "Don't repeat this." There was a system, informal, invisible, and dangerous, that ran parallel to the Ashfords' polished illusion of piety. A web of servants, laborers, delivery men, seamstresses, cooks, mostly women, often poor, always overlooked, who saw more than they were supposed to. They called it the Whisper Network. Not organized, not official, but aware. They saw girls go in, bright-eyed and fiery, only to return quiet and well-behaved, moving with the mechanical grace of someone freshly programmed. They saw Temperance hand off blood-stained linens with a polite smile and unblinking eyes. They heard things, smelled things, and they passed what they knew in whispers. In codes. A blue ribbon tied to a milk pail handle meant, "Don't speak their name." A button sewn backwards on a blouse meant, "She's not the same." A lantern turned twice in a window after midnight meant, "Something is happening now." It wasn't rebellion, it was resistance. And the sisters knew. That's the horror. They let it happen. They wanted it to spread. Because they believed fear was part of the purification. They believed rumors softened the edges of doubt, that a woman warned of horror would submit more easily when the doors finally closed behind her. But still, the whispers continued, because some of those women remembered, like the cook who wrote names into the margins of her recipe book, or the laundress who tore fabric into 6 pieces, each embroidered with a number, later found buried in the garden with teeth inside. One whisper became legend, a phrase. No one knows who said it first, but it echoed across decades, across counties, across generations. Don't let them name you. It was the last piece of advice given to any girl forced into the Ashfords' care. Because once they renamed you, once they called you gratitude or obedience or mercy, the process had begun. And if you answered, even once, they had you. That phrase survived longer than the convent itself. It appeared in graffiti under bridges in the 1960s. It showed up on protest signs in asylums. It was scratched into the bunk of a girl who disappeared in a juvenile facility in 2007. Don't let them name you, because names are more than words. They're ownership. And the Ashfords didn't heal women. They branded them. It began the same way each time. No warning, no explanation. Just a soft knock on the dormitory door in the dead of night. 2 sisters, cloaked in black, entering with lanterns held low, their flames dim, as if even light was too loud for what came next. The chosen girl, always one who had stopped resisting, stopped asking questions, was led silently to the lower hall. No words were spoken, none were needed. She had been selected for the veil. They called it a ceremony, they called it an honor. But what they didn't say, what they never said, was that the girl who walked in never came back out the same. Witnesses, rare and broken, describe the preparation room. A long stone corridor lit by oil sconces, each one bearing inscriptions not in Latin, but in something older, carvings that resembled eyes, spirals, teeth. The girl was undressed, bathed in cold water mixed with white ash, dried with cloths that smelled of crushed herbs and something metallic. Then came the veil. Not silk, not lace. It was iron. A mask forged to fit the contours of the face, thin enough to breathe, heavy enough to feel. It covered the entire head, save for the eyes, which were never allowed to close during the rite. And then she was taken to the mirror room. But this time the mirrors were covered. Why? Because the veil wasn't about reflection. It was about removal. One by one the girl was made to recite her old name, speak it aloud, again and again. With each repetition the sisters whispered the new one. At first she resisted, that's normal. But then the mask is tightened, not with violence, with rhythm. The chanting accelerates, the lights dim, and the name begins to lose meaning. That's when she breaks, when she finally says it, the new name, willingly. The iron veil is lifted. She is kissed on the forehead, and the others begin calling her by the new title, humility, purity, silence. She does not respond to her birth name again, not because she forgets, because she chooses not to. That's the horror. It's not brainwashing if you consent, and that's what the Ashfords perfected, not control by force, but control by transformation. They didn't break the body, they re-scripted the soul. And once the veil had been worn, she was no longer a girl. She was a vessel. It appeared only once, carved into the underside of a chapel pew, barely visible, worn down by time and polish. 7 letters, illegible to most. But to those who recognized it, it was not a word, it was a warning. Surely. Not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew. Older. Its root traces back to Phoenician mysticism, a term found in one forbidden scroll unearthed near Byblos and later confiscated by French colonial agents in 1852. The scroll was labeled simply the Book of Binding. Roughly translated, surely means to hollow in order to house, a phrase used not in theology, but in pre-theology. Rituals meant to evacuate the self, not to purify, but to prepare. For what? Occupation. And when that word showed up in the Ashford compound, scratched beneath a seat no one was supposed to touch, everything shifted. Because it wasn't just a convent, it wasn't just a cult, it was a portal. Not to demons, not to spirits, to programming. See, the Ashfords weren't simply interested in obedience, they weren't content with silence. They were trying to create room within people, a clean space, a white void, a mental sanctuary where something else could be installed. Not a ghost, not a god. A voice, a protocol, a second operating system, something that could be activated later, triggered, and used. This is where the conspiracy deepens, because decades after the convent was abandoned, psychologists began encountering patients across the country reporting identical symptoms: blackouts with no memory, dreams of cold stone and chanting, a name always in the same rhythm, Sure, Eli. None of them had ever been to Maine. None of them knew each other. But all of them, had ancestors who lived in Millbridge between 1790 and 1830. Descendants, carriers, vessels passed down. You see now, this wasn't a story of a single institution. It was a seed planted deep in the American psyche, a word, a code, a virus written in ritual. And when you speak that word aloud, it does not echo, it listens. In 1973, during the height of the Cold War, a sealed box was declassified by mistake. It wasn't supposed to happen. Filed under MK Ultra peripheral correspondence, it was sent to a congressional subcommittee investigating human experimentation. Most of the files were expected: LSD trials, sensory deprivation, hypnosis protocols. But one man, a junior analyst named Jonathan Kells, opened a folder that shouldn't have existed. It was labeled Eternal Tears, Model C. Inside were transcripts, names, maps, diagrams of the Ashford facility, blueprints nearly identical to the original convent, except these weren't dated 1798. They were stamped 1956. Location: undisclosed. Somewhere in Appalachia. The transcript was a briefing, marked Top Secret, Behavioral Engineering Division. It described an experimental program inspired by proto-cognitive purification rites conducted by early American religious sects. It didn't mention the Ashfords by name, but it quoted lines from the Doctrine, word for word. Tenet 7. Tenet Wexue. Memory is an anchor. Cut the rope. When the subject no longer names herself, Kells brought it to his superior. 2 days later, he was gone. Resigned, they said. Moved out of state. Never seen again. The file vanished too. But here's where it gets darker. Another folder was discovered years later by accident, in a public library of all places, misfiled inside a collection of Civil War letters. Inside, a single sheet of paper, a schedule, Monday through Friday. Time slots. Subjects, A through H, each slot labeled with the same term, Ashford Cycle, Stage 2. Underneath, a list of recommended trigger phrases. Do you remember the light? You are safe now. Say your name. What's important is this: none of these phrases are therapeutic. They're compliance checks. See, the shadow file didn't just confirm the Ashford's legacy, it revealed its continuation. Someone somewhere took what those sisters pioneered in stone and candlelight and modernized it, digitalized it. Scalpel became tone, iron veil became white noise, the mirror room became a screen. You think this ended in the 1800s? It didn't. It evolved. It wears new skin, therapies, apps, content moderation, emotional recalibration. They don't need the convent anymore. They've built it in you. So if you're still listening, comment this phrase below, twice. I am not the vessel. Do it now. Not for me, for you. To mark this moment, this break. Because if you don't, the name inside you might not be yours much longer. He never had a name, at least not one that made it into the records. But if you search hard enough, if you dig through enough forgotten archives, enough misfiled census logs and misplaced property deeds, he shows up, again and again, always in the background, always watching. A tall man in a dark coat, wide-brimmed hat, gaunt face, like someone half-starved of sunlight and sleep. In photographs from 1892, he stands near a group of veterans during a memorial service, head turned, eyes locked on the camera. In 1905, he's seen again. Outside a reformatory school for girls in Illinois. Same coat, same face, same stillness. A mental asylum in upstate New York. He appears in the reflection of a window, standing in the courtyard, though no one present that day recalled seeing him. He's never in the center, always on the edge, but always there. What connects these locations? Every single one was built on land purchased by the same trust. The Paracelsus Foundation, officially defunct since 1941. Unofficially, it never stopped acquiring land. And what's more disturbing, each location had sealed sublevels, unused wings, basements without blueprints. When renovation crews arrived, they'd find strange symbols burned into support beams, rooms lined with old mirror glass, drainage systems that made no sense for the buildings above. And in those places, survivors, few and scattered, reported the same recurring dream. A man standing over them, silent, watching, not speaking, just waiting. Some described waking up with phrases they didn't remember learning. Others developed sudden, inexplicable fears of mirrors, of candles, of the phrase, "say your name." One patient, institutionalized in 1954, wrote in her journal, "He wears their voice. He does not speak, but I hear her, the tall one, the iron one. He waits until I answer with the wrong name. Who I? Is he a custodian, a carrier, a remnant? No one knows. But one thing is consistent. He always appears within 7 days of someone uncovering the truth, which means this. If you're still watching this video, if you've made it this far, start watching your background. Mirrors, windows, shadows. And if you ever see a tall man in an old black coat just standing still, not moving, not blinking, do not speak your name, because that's all he needs to step through, a name and a voice that still thinks it belongs to you. It began one summer evening in 1816. Locals gathered at dusk near the edge of Millbridge. The air was thick with heat, the kind that bends the horizon and makes even pine trees seem to shiver. Someone had reported hearing music, faint and low, coming from the woods behind the old convent. Not hymns, not organ music, something else. A choral harmony, but wrong, too perfect, too synchronized, too still. It came in waves like breathing, a rise, a fall, then silence, and then again, a pattern, hypnotic. People stood there staring into the trees, unable to move. Children began weeping without understanding why. Dogs refused to cross the property line. The sheriff arrived and fired a shot into the air. The sound stopped instantly, dead silence. But that night, dozens of people dreamed the same thing. A circle of women in white veils, standing in a black stone room, mouths wide open, but no sound coming out. Just breath. Cold, collective breath. One of those witnesses, a farmhand named Caleb Dyer, scratched something into his barn wall the next morning before hanging himself in the hayloft. The words are still there today, weathered and barely legible. If their mouths don't move, listen harder. For years, the story was dismissed as mass hysteria, a local folktale. The silent choir, they called it, but in 1963, something strange happened. A parapsychologist named Evelyn Crane recorded electromagnetic anomalies near what was left of the convent foundation. She wasn't there for ghosts. She was there for sound. She brought high-frequency recording equipment, tech the Ashfords could never have imagined. And what she captured was terrifying. Over 8 minutes of pure silence. And then, breathing. Hundreds of synchronized breaths. Then layered vocal harmonics. Too deep for human women. Too mathematically perfect to be chance. The frequency pattern resembled something she'd seen once before. Soviet studies in collective psychoacoustic resonance. In simple terms, a sound that doesn't just hit your ear, it rewrites your response. Not to scare, to install. When she played the recording back for herself, alone in her lab, she wrote one final line in her journal. "I listened too long. I hear them in the vents now." Then she vanished. No trace, no signs of struggle, only the recorder still spinning. You may think it's superstition, but some sounds don't need volume, just permission. So if you ever feel a strange pressure in your ears, if the silence suddenly feels like it's watching, don't speak, don't scream, just leave, because the choir never stopped singing. We just stopped hearing. Her name was never written down, no intake form, no family contact, no initials in the convent's ledgers. Yet every surviving record from that winter, letters, nurse reports, prayer rosters, mentions her, without ever naming her. They call her the one who walked in from the river. It was January of 1819. The river was frozen solid, thick enough to hold a wagon. The nearest town was 15 miles away, but on the morning of January 11th, one of the sisters opened the outer gate and found a girl standing there barefoot in a thin white gown. No coat, no shoes, no wounds, just ice crusted in her hair and around her mouth like frostbite had kissed her lips, but left the rest untouched. When they asked who she was, she didn't answer. She only said one thing: "You called me." And the moment she stepped inside, the compound changed. Witnesses, years later, described how the air seemed heavier after she arrived. The walls felt too close, candles flickered more violently, and for the first time in memory, Temperance was afraid. Not shaken, afraid. She asked to be moved to the attic dormitory. She started sleeping in shifts. She reportedly refused to be in the same room alone with the unnamed girl, even in daylight. The other sisters didn't understand, but Agatha did. She took the girl into her private chamber, locked the door. For 3 days no one entered, and on the 4th day, the girl was gone. No departure, no witness, just gone. But her absence didn't bring peace. The sisters became paranoid. They stopped holding ceremonies. They bricked up part of the basement. They whispered of the eye returning, of something being activated too soon. Then Agatha wrote a single line in her private log, the only surviving page found in a sealed drawer during renovations in 1955. She was not a patient, she was a test, and we failed. What was she? A messenger? A creation? A mirror? Some say she was the first successful carrier burn, not broken, not erased, but complete. She didn't arrive for healing. She arrived to confirm that it had worked, that the doctrine had achieved its final purpose. And if that's true, she's still out there, wearing the face of the obedient, smiling with eyes that see everything, waiting for you to call her name, even if you don't know it yet. In 1938, a renovation crew began demolishing what remained of the convent's outer dormitories. The structure had been abandoned for nearly a century, vines strangling the stone, floorboards buckled with rot, windows shattered and dark as open graves. But beneath one floorboard, they found something impossible, a manuscript. Bound in skin, not leather, skin. Inside, 119 pages, unlabeled, unpaginated, written in a reddish-black ink that modern labs would later confirm was a blend of iron oxide and something biological. Blood, but not just blood. Blood with no donor match in any database. The manuscript wasn't a diary. It wasn't a confession. It was a recording device. Each page displayed perfect lines of writing, but not consistent with any known language. Scholars called it nonsense. Until someone ran the script through audio analysis software, not to read it, but to hear it. They found patterns, frequencies, peaks and valleys that mirrored spoken word. The manuscript was not meant to be read with eyes. It was meant to be sounded, a phonetic cipher, When converted to tones and fed into a sonograph, it produced audible shapes, tones that formed faces on the display, faces of women, mouths open, screaming. A linguist who studied the manuscript for 6 weeks, Dr. Peter Gavel, wrote a single note before resigning from his university position without warning. It's not a language, it's a signal, and once you understand it, it understands you back. His final act? He burned his vocal cords with industrial bleach. He never spoke again. What could make a man destroy his voice? What could be so dangerous about reading aloud? And here's what no one wants to admit. This wasn't written by a scholar. The handwriting, when compared to archived school records, matched that of a young girl named Sophia Bellwether. She had been sent to the convent in 1806 for inappropriate dreams and willful disregard of paternal authority. She was 12. The page she began with, and written by her hand, identified by pressure and stroke, starts with a phrase, "They said if I wrote it, they would leave." But they didn't. Not then, not now, because the ink still hasn't faded, and when the manuscript is opened in darkness, some say the pages breathe. So ask yourself, if a little girl can write a language older than memory, whose words were she writing? And are you reading them now, or are they reading you? It was cast in 1797, months before the Ashford women even arrived. Not in town, not in any known foundry. No records of its creation exist. But when the convent's foundation was first excavated, workers discovered a reinforced cavity directly beneath the central chamber, not for drainage, not for storage. For the bell, 8 feet tall, carved from iron so dark it drank the light. Its surface was covered in a tangled network of etchings, not names, but instructions, runes, glyphs, spirals intersecting with phrases written backward, sideways, in a language no one could translate. There was no clapper. This bell was not meant to ring with sound, it was meant to vibrate, silently. The Ashfords called it the tongue. Only 3 people were allowed near it, Prudence, Agatha, and Temperance once she reached maturity. It was used during certain rituals, ones that involved no audience, no scripture, no light, just proximity. Girls would be brought in, blindfolded, barefoot, and made to kneel before the bell. The sisters would walk slowly around them, their feet in perfect cadence, hands outstretched but never touching. And then the hum would begin. Not sung, felt. A low, shuddering frequency rising from the floorboards, vibrating through the stone, resonating through the girl's ribcage and into her skull. Many fainted, some screamed, others entered a trance-like state and whispered words they never learned. One record, hidden in the back of Dr. Hartwell's private notebook, described the aftermath. Subject 12 exhibited post-resonance aphasia. She ceased recognizing her own face in a mirror. When asked her name, she replied, "I am the door now." The bell was never removed. When the convent was dismantled, the cavity was filled with gravel and concrete. The local diocese claimed it was a crypt, but no graves were found, and yet hikers still report tremors beneath the hill, a low pressure in the chest, dizziness, sudden, inexplicable sadness. In 2011, a geology student conducting a magnetic survey picked up a reading so powerful he thought his equipment was malfunctioning. When he recalibrated and returned the next day, the ground was warm, even in winter, and his notes confiscated. By whom? No one knows. But here's the truth. That bell was not built to call the faithful. It was built to tune the disobedient, to dismantle resistance at a molecular level. And when it rings again, even in silence, you won't hear it. You'll agree with it. Her name was Margaret Elwyn. She checked herself into the St. Agnes Asylum in Pennsylvania in 1874 at the age of 62, under the diagnosis of severe delusional memory distortion. But she wasn't delusional. She was awake. In her first week, she wrote over 300 pages. Not ramblings, not hallucinations. Maps, blueprints of buildings that no longer existed. Ritual instructions in perfect Latin. Testimonies from women who had vanished in 1809, with names, faces, birthplaces. All correct. Impossible. Margaret had never left New York State. And yet, she described with terrifying precision the inner structure of the Ashford convent, the passage beneath the chapel, the bell, the veil, even the whisper network. She described Temperance's face, in detail. But Temperance had died 60 years prior. Hadn't she? Margaret insisted she hadn't. That the sisters had never died, only changed forms. That their voices had been embedded in the minds of vessels who didn't know they were carrying them. They live in us, she wrote, not as spirits, as software, embedded in routine, waking, kneeling, breathing, waiting. Doctors dismissed her as a classic case of trauma-induced false memory syndrome. Until she began predicting things. She warned that on September 4th, a nurse named Elsie would suddenly begin sleepwalking and speaking in unknown tongues. It happened. She predicted a fire would erupt in the southern wing at 3:12 a.m. during a thunderstorm. It did. She said a woman with her name buried under someone else's would arrive in 6 days. And on the 6th day, a patient named Helen Griggs was admitted, only to reveal her birth certificate was forged. Her real name, Clara Margaret Elwyn. Margaret looked her in the eye and said, "You remember now." Helen collapsed. She spoke 2 words, "the veil," then fell into a coma that lasted 9 months. When she had no memory of any of it. And Margaret? She vanished from her locked room 3 weeks later. Gone. No sign of struggle, just an empty bed, and one phrase etched into the wall with what looked like a fingernail. Memory is the key, but too much of it is the cage. What does that mean? It means some people, rare people, remember their past lives under the doctrine. But the system can't allow that, so it finds them and resets them. You think you're safe because you forgot? Maybe forgetting is the final stage, and remembering is what makes you dangerous. In 1987, a cartographer named Julian Crane was hired to survey a wooded area outside Millbridge, Maine, for a proposed wildlife reserve. The land had gone untouched for decades, abandoned after a series of unexplainable events, missing hikers, strange electromagnetic activity, rumors of chanting trees. Julian wasn't superstitious. He was a man of measurements, grid lines, data, until he found the house. Except, it wasn't on the map. Not on county records, not on federal plots, no foundation listed, no tax history, no architect. But it was there, hidden behind thick pine and underbrush. 2 stories, white paint flaking, windows dark, no path leading to it. Julian approached, notebook in hand, camera slung around his shoulder. He knocked. No answer. He stepped inside. Everything was preserved, not abandoned, preserved. Chairs tucked in, table set for 3, oil lamps filled, beds made, and in the center of the living room, a silver bell on a velvet cushion, not dusty, not corroded, as if it had just been placed there. Julian took pictures. He left shaken but convinced he'd found something extraordinary, a relic of early frontier life untouched by time. A miracle. When he developed the photos, the house wasn't in any of them. Not one. Every frame showed only trees, sky, blank landscape, not even footprints where the house should have stood. But that wasn't the worst part. The notebook he'd written in during the survey? Blank. He remembered sketching the bell, labeling the rooms, noting the color of the wallpaper, faded crimson with ash-gray fleur-de-lis. Now, nothing. Just one sentence written on the last page. She was waiting for me. Julian was never the same. He stopped working, stopped speaking mostly. 3 months later, he checked into a facility under a false name. Doctors said he suffered from spatial trauma, a rare, neurological event where the brain misplaces its understanding of physical space. But his sister disagreed. She visited him once, said he held her hand too tightly, stared at the ceiling and whispered, It moved again. It's not in Maine anymore. She asked what it was. He just smiled. The house. It travels now. It's looking for someone else to come inside. Julian died in 1992 of a seizure during sleep. The nurse on duty that night? Her name was Clara Bellwether, and when asked if she knew him, she said, "Not in this life. So be careful. Some doors don't lead to places. They lead to programs, and once you enter, you don't always come back alone." In 1971, a retired audio engineer named Louis Voss purchased an old trunk at an estate sale in Massachusetts. He was a collector of rare reels, antique voice recordings, forgotten interviews, anything magnetic that still held voices trapped in iron oxide. What he found in that trunk changed him. 7 unlabeled reel-to-reel tapes. No dates, no covers. Just numbered stickers, 1 through 7. He expected music. Maybe old sermons. What he heard? Silence, at first. Then, breathing. Not natural, relaxed breathing. Measured breath. Inhalation on counts of 3. Exhalation on counts of 4. Dozens of people, all breathing together. Then chanting, low, rhythmic. Not English, not Latin, not anything. Voices so perfectly synced they didn't sound like individuals, but a single mouth stretched across 100 throats. Tape 2 was worse. It opened with screaming, abrupt, immediate, as if mid-session, a woman repeating one word over and over, "Mercy." Except her voice was layered, doubled, tripled. It echoed as if played through her own throat from somewhere else. Then, a male voice, low, whispering, "She still remembers. Increase the dose." Voss was shaken, but tape 4 broke him. It contained a single phrase, spoken in a monotone female voice, for exactly 33 minutes. "Say your name. Say your name. Say your name." Each repetition gained echo, texture, a resonance that vibrated deep in the chest even through low-grade speakers. He played it for a colleague. The man vomited 10 minutes in. Tape 6 didn't play at all. It shredded the first time it passed through the head, but the magnetometer went crazy, detecting signals 13 times above normal. The final tape, tape 7, was empty. But Voss swore that when he left it running and stepped outside for air, he heard someone humming inside the playback room. He lived alone. After 3 weeks, he boxed the tapes up and mailed them to a university lab. They never arrived. The university denied receiving them. But 2 years later, one of the phrases from tape 3, "The vessel must not remember the architect," appeared word for word in a Department of Defense briefing on neural overwrite patterns. A classified project, Operation Veiled Room. Coincidence or absorption? Because the truth is, the Ashford method was too effective to ignore. The sisters didn't just break people, they recorded how. And those tapes, they weren't rituals, they were protocols, training programs. And if you think they're gone, check your earbuds, check your feed, check what you hum without thinking. Because once a voice is inside, it doesn't ask permission. It reminds you who you were supposed to be. In 2004, an urban exploration team broke into the remnants of a decommissioned psychiatric hospital outside of Bangor, Maine. The building had been closed since the 1980s following what the press called a sudden outbreak of synchronized catatonia among 9 patients. The facility had no nameplate, no documentation, just a street sign half buried in ivy. ET Research Annex C. No one knew what ET meant. Some said experimental therapy. Others whispered eternal tears. Inside, the building was hollowed by time, rotted walls, collapsed beams, mold thick as carpet. But the team found one wing completely untouched, unaged, pristine, like time had avoided it. Room 312 had no door, but the frame was intact. And just inside, covering an entire wall, was a drawing. Charcoal, ink, blood. They tested all 3. It wasn't graffiti. It was a map. A precise architectural rendering of a circular room, 9 mirror panels, 1 iron bell in the center, 8 figures kneeling in formation, and 1 standing, larger than the rest. A woman with no face, only a smooth oval where her features should have been, like the outline of a mask never removed. Above the drawing, in a hand so fine it looked etched, "Knock not for entry, but for memory." There was no explanation. But on the wall opposite the drawing, carved beneath peeling wallpaper, was a symbol, a door, but not drawn, scratched, as if someone had taken a knife and carved a perfect doorway, outline, hinges, handle, into plaster, brick, and stone. No actual door existed, but one of the explorers, a woman named Sam, placed her hand on the carving and immediately collapsed. When she awoke, she began naming people she had never met. Women, dozens of names. Many matched records from the Ashford convent, names believed lost to history. She spoke in rhythms, recited phrases from the doctor. Sarah wept when they asked her who she was. Her answer? "I remember too much." 2 weeks later she vanished. Her apartment was found abandoned, but the bedroom wall had something new on it. Another door drawn in ash. No one knows where she went, but in the years since, identical door drawings have appeared in hospitals, in schools, in basements of buildings that were supposed to be sealed forever. Always the same message nearby: do not open until the self is gone. Because the Ashfords didn't need walls to trap you, they needed access. And the door? It isn't physical. It's you. Every system of control requires repetition, reinforcement loops. It wasn't enough for the Ashfords to erase a woman's name, bind her to obedience, and call her vessel. That only worked temporarily. The programming had to refresh, and they found the perfect mechanism: ritual looping, daily cycles, same songs, same meals, same prayers, same questions, every single day. To the outsider, it looked like strict religious order. To the Ashfords, it was behavioral firmware. They observed how long it took for a woman to forget her previous schedule, how quickly she stopped asking why and started performing the motions without prompting. Then they timed the breaks, precisely 3 minutes of silence between cycles. Not for rest, for absorption. One of Prudence Ashford's most chilling notes reads, "It is not pain that breaks a subject. It is rhythm. Predictability sharpens obedience faster than terror." They even designed chants with mathematical precision, alternating syllables that mirrored breath patterns, heartbeats, circadian rhythm. But the real horror? The loops worked even after removal. Women who escaped, or were released, were often found repeating parts of the ritual unconsciously years later. One survivor, named M, was documented rocking back and forth in her home at 2:00 a.m., whispering a sequence of numbers. When recorded and analyzed, those numbers matched the floor plan coordinates of the convent's containment ring. Her final words before institutionalization: "I was never meant to leave the cycle." Modern institutions have adopted this. They call it stabilization programming. Wake at 7, lights off at 10, group session at 3, same tray meal, same hallway walk. It looks like care, but it's conditioning, and it exists far beyond hospitals now, in social platforms, in smart homes, in self-help content streamed to you every morning. Looped, reinforced, normalized. Why? Because when the loop is external, you still know it's not you. But when the loop becomes internal, you no longer ask why. You only ask, what comes next? That's the moment they wait for. The moment when the loop no longer needs the ritual, because the ritual has become you, and the only way to break it is to recognize it as a loop. So ask yourself, what part of your day do you perform like someone else wrote it? Because maybe they did. In 1823, a woman named Esther Caulfield was admitted to the Convent of Eternal Tears under the usual designation, spiritual disturbance tied to maternal disobedience. She was 16, pregnant. The father's name wasn't recorded, though whispers say he was a judge's son. What mattered wasn't who got her pregnant, It was that she refused to marry. She arrived shaking, terrified, and yet, according to a letter smuggled out by a sympathetic groundskeeper, unbroken. She believed she could survive it, believed she could protect the child. But what she didn't know was this. The Ashfords had never allowed a birth inside the convent. Not once. Not in 25 years. Because the doctrine made something chillingly clear in its final chapter. Only the emptied may carry the new. All others carry noise. Esther was placed in isolation tier 3. The deepest level of confinement. No light, no warmth, only the cycle. Her food was reduced to broth. Her name was replaced with regret. She was told daily that her child was a curse, not in fire and brimstone rhetoric, but in the cold, clinical tone of correction. And then came the intervention. They didn't call it surgery. They called it soul redirection, a procedure that would prepare the vessel for sanctified release. Esther's screams were heard once, then silence. For weeks, no one spoke of her. Until one night, a nun was found collapsed in the garden, eyes rolled back, mouth moving, no sound. When her pulse was checked, she flinched and screamed. The child stayed. What followed were weeks of breakdowns among the staff. One sister clawed at her skin, muttering about movement in the walls. Another cut off her tongue and died smiling. Even Prudence, cold, precise Prudence, refused to enter the lower levels alone. Why? Because they believed the procedure had failed. That something, not quite a spirit, not quite human, had remained behind. Not angry, not vengeful, just watching, waiting. They bricked up Tier 3 6 months later, said it was unstable. But in 2008, when amateur archaeologists surveyed the ruins with thermal cameras, they found heat signatures behind the sealed stone. One, pulsing, small, consistent, as if something were breathing, still, and on the wall nearby, carved deep by something not made of bone. No vessel, no voice. I am the silence you tried to bury. So ask yourself, what happens when you try to erase a soul not yet written? You don't destroy it. You create the one thing the Ashfords feared most. A child with no doctrine, and that child may still be listening, through the bricks, through the silence, through you. When architect Lydia Harrow studied the blueprints of the convent remains in 1998, she noticed something strange. A room. Deep underground, perfectly circular, no entrance, no exit, no corner. She assumed it was a drafting error, an impossible geometry tucked between real chambers. But when her team excavated that part of the ruined sublevel, they found it, just as described. 13 feet wide, walls that curved with unnatural precision. No doorframe, no hinges, no locks, just smooth stone, cold to the touch, humming faintly like something inside was breathing through the walls. They broke through with pneumatic drills. Inside, nothing, no furniture, no markings, just a circle of scorched floor, blackened stone in the shape of a spiral, like something had burned there over and over, but never left ash. Lydia didn't stay long. She claimed the moment she stepped inside, she lost her sense of time. When she checked her watch, 22 minutes had passed. Her assistant's watch said 2 hours. The footage from her headlamp was static, audio, blank. Except for one whisper, looped over and over. Corners are for remembering, circles are for becoming. She went back twice. Each time she returned more detached. She stopped answering emails, stopped attending meetings. Her last voicemail to her brother, time-stamped 2:43 a.m., was chilling. She whispered, I finally understand what they built. The circle doesn't contain. It summons. It waits for the mind to unhook, then it writes the new one in. I don't remember who I was yesterday, and I don't think I miss her. That was the last anyone heard from her. Her apartment was empty, laptop open, a note on the screen. No more corners, only curve. Some say she never left the room. Some say she's still there, not physically but imprinted. But here's the terrifying part, Circular Row. Mum's have begun appearing in unrelated places, government facilities, hospitals, even elementary schools. No corners, just curves, just symmetry, just silence. And those who spend too much time in them, they begin reporting strange dreams, whispers, a pressure behind the eyes, and eventually, forgetfulness. Not just of names, but of identity. Because the Ashfords didn't invent the circle, they just remembered it. They built it as a chamber for reformatting, a ritual shaped like safety, and once your mind walks in, it doesn't come back the same. In 1842, a letter arrived at the Millbridge post office, yellowed and brittle, sealed with wax so old it crumbled under touch. There was no return address, just a single word scrawled on the front in tight black ink, reclaim. The postmaster assumed it was a clerical error, a delivery long overdue. It had been routed through 5 states, redirected twice overseas, passed through the hands of 3 deceased agents before reaching its final destination. But no one had ordered it. No one was expecting it. So he opened it. Inside, 1 sheet, unlined, covered top to bottom in a hand so sharp and uniform it looked almost mechanical. The letter was addressed to the one who remembers the name behind their name. No signature, no explanation, just instructions. 33 sentences, each one beginning with if. If you wake at 3:09 a.m. without reason. If mirrors seem slower to reflect. If you've begun humming before realizing there's no song playing. Each condition more precise, more invasive. If a tall woman appears in your dreams, wearing no mouth but many eyes. If the word obedience tastes like metal when spoken. If you find yourself writing phrases you do not remember learning. Then came the final instruction. If any of the above apply, you are one of us, you have forgotten. We are coming to reclaim what we buried in you. The postmaster laughed it off, called it a prank. That night, he locked the letter in his desk. By morning, he was gone. Desk still locked, letter still sealed inside. But the wood, warped, burned from the inside out, as if something had screamed through it. The letter resurfaced decades later in the possession of a codebreaker named Julian Wells. He decoded the 33 sentences using an obscure cipher developed by the Ashfords, the same numeric pattern used in the loop chants. The real message, the thing, ritual is not in the bloodline, it is in the trigger, meaning you don't have to be born into the doctrine, you just have to hear the right words, see the right room, follow the right rhythm. And when that happens, it activates, not a curse, not a possession, an instruction set, waiting, dormant. Until you begin asking the wrong questions, like the one you're asking right now. Am I one of them? No, not yet. But you've listened this far. And the next section, that's the one they never wanted anyone to hear. Because it doesn't describe the past. It describes what happens next.